Hello, everyone. This is Wyland with the FPV podcast, doing the last episode of DRL. So, we're talking about the DRL Championships in London, England. Got some really exciting things to talk about, so this is going to be a rather long episode. Plus, I also have some things that I want to talk about as a wrap up for the year. For this podcast, I'm going to go ahead and break it up into several segments. The first segment will be talking about the first hour of DRL, which is basically the elimination round, and then the second hour, which is actually the championship race. And then the last segment will be just wrap up, final thoughts, and then what we hope to see in 2018. So let's go ahead and get started. So let's go ahead and talk about the first hour, which is the elimination round, which I find to be a little bit strange because during the playoffs, what you heard was all of the pilots were talking about making it to London, making it to the championships. But really, the first hour is another elimination round, so they really haven't quite made it yet. So it was a little awkward. Plus, the way that they did it was a little bit awkward because they introduced this round robin format, but they didn't really spend a lot of time explaining it or the reason why they actually went with this format this late in the season, what the benefits were and what they were trying to accomplish. Plus, when they actually ran the heats, they didn't run all of the heats. So it felt a little segmented. It didn't really flow right because all of a sudden you'll start watching and there's already points that were accumulated from previous heats, but you didn't see those previous heats. So it's a little bit strange. I didn't really feel like it flowed well. There was no continuity to this episode. Plus, the side stories that they do in between heats, it really didn't match the atmosphere that we're seeing at the race, right? There was a lot of tension. The pilots were all stressed, yet we're still seeing some of the same backstories that we saw before, which is very low key, very subtle, very relaxing. It just didn't meet the atmosphere of the race. They should have, done footage or background stories of something with much more tension, like what does it mean to be here? What happens if you do well or don't do well? What your goals are? Stuff that actually builds on top of that tension. But we really didn't see that. So it didn't flow well into those little backstories or those, different segments that they were showing. It was just a little bit strange. Now, all of that being said, it really didn't matter. And the reason for that was because the racing was so good. Time after time, I talk to people about the DRL championships, and they all say the racing was great. They love to watch the racing. Everybody was so close together. All of the pilots are so well matched with each other. They just really enjoyed the episode because of the racing, which is what we want to see as the audience and also as people that want to make the sport grow. One of the reasons why the racing was so good was because of the track design and the venue. Alexandra Palace in London, England, what an amazing place. What an awesome place to have the championship drone race. Just couldn't believe how beautiful that place is. Also, the track design, it was big, it was fast, it was sweepy. It's one of those tracks where pilots can really push the limits, and if they make a slight mistake, the track doesn't punish them by wrecking them. They don't crash out. So pilots can afford to really push their machines all the way to the maximum, which gives you those tight groups because everybody's able to push their machines right to the edge of the limit, in which now it's about racing lines. Now it's about not making mistakes, which is going to give you the lead. It's not about who can push the throttle just a little bit more. Almost everybody had it wide open, right? Because it was a fast and flowy track, and that's what you want to see. You want to see tracks that allow them to push the limits of the machine, but if they make a mistake, it's going to cost them pole position. It's not going to cause them to wreck out, in which the racing is going to be less, it's going to be less enticing because there's less machines in the air. During the championship round, we saw almost all the machines running at the same time. The funny thing is, though, during the elimination round, the first hour, what we're seeing is a lot of pilots wrecking out. And I think the reason why the pilots were wrecking out was because of the tension. They were so stressed out that they were making mistakes and a lot of mid-airs were happening. I don't feel like they were actually doing their best. And what I would say is that's a strike against the round robin format because it seemed like the pilots, they didn't really quite grasp it. They didn't like the fact that they were being shuffled in and out, and that just didn't contribute to really great racing. So you have this format in which all of the pilots get to race against each other and they get to accumulate points fairly in some sort of fashion. But at the same time, the racing suffered because the pilots were stressed. There was no comfort zone there, and there was a lot of wrecks. I mean, during the championships, there wasn't near as many wrecks. So I feel like that has something to do with the round robin format or just the tension that you know that the last two people were being eliminated. This brings us to the racing and the pilots. So from the heats that we did see, we know that Anub was on a hot streak at the very beginning, but towards the end, he seemed to be crashing out and he just seemed to be losing focus. Really don't know what happened there. Wish we had some more backstory on why he was doing so well at the beginning, but then he kind of just lost track of himself, or he kind of just lost focus and wasn't a part of the conversation towards the end. Another interesting thing was that Gab was having his early struggles early on. We usually see Gab having a very fast, strong early start, but this time around he was struggling at the beginning and he was able to, make enough of a consistent run towards the end to make it into the second day, but it wasn't one of his strongest performances. He was definitely part of the bottom third that made it in. So that was something that was very different to see. Jet, we continue to see his resurgence. He's really confident at this point, and he seems to be having a lot of fun. He's one of those type of people where, the bigger the pressure, the more excitement that he builds around himself, the better he does. It's really interesting to watch him work when he's excited about racing. Wild Willie, he's the type of person that you just never know what to expect. One time, he's going to be all over the place. He's making too many risks. He's crashing out. And then the next time he's Mr. Consistent, he's always there. But one thing we do know is that he is a fast pilot. He can definitely make his way around the track. He can work through traffic. And he's also like one of the luckiest pilots or one of the most skilled pilots, probably both, at being able to get out of mid-airs because he gets into a lot of collisions, but he still stays in the heat and he still finishes, and that's how he accumulates points. He's one of the pilots where it's really fun to watch him work. Now, we have two Europeans, of course, Duncan and McStrawley. We know Duncan, super good. As long as he can stay in the air and stay aggressive, he's going to be in the conversation. McStrawley, extremely aggressive. This is a track that I would think suits him, but he didn't really do all that well, right? This is a very fast and flowy, very aggressive track. You can really pin it open and try to be aggressive, and it shouldn't wreck you out too often, but we just didn't see that. Not sure why. Provo, he's kind of like the granddaddy, but he does so well. He's the type of person that kind of sneaks up on you because he's always there. He's always a part of the conversation. You just don't know it until you look at the points and you're like, wow, he's doing really well for himself. And then lastly, we have Jaws. And to me, he's very similar to Provo in that he does enough things right. He hangs around and he always gives himself a chance at a podium spot or a championship spot, the winning circle spot. So he's been on a hot streak, which is very surprising when he was actually one of the ones eliminated along with McStrawley. I expected those two to actually do really well, and the fact that they just didn't, it's just kind of surprising. It's one of those things where this is the reason why we watch the episodes, because you would think, oh, I know who's going to get eliminated, and then you watch it and you saw how it played out, and you're like, wow, I didn't expect that. That was kind of interesting. So before we move on to the second hour, there is one heat that I want to focus in on and talk about, which is the last heat, the 8th heat, in which Duncan took first place in order to get into the championship round, which is amazing, by the way. One of the things that Duncan did was that he did an accelerated power loop, and that played a really critical role in the second hour in the championship round, right? Up until that point, almost everybody was taking it easy. Well, not taking it easy, but they weren't as aggressive as what Duncan was. And what Duncan was able to prove was that you can take an extremely aggressive, accelerated power loop all the way around and be extremely fast. It looked like it was risky, but he did it so well that it just felt like, wow, everybody should be able to do this. And you saw on the last heat of the championship round how important that was. And I think it just started there. I think Duncan proved that you can have a really aggressive line through that power loop and you can make it fast. And I think that was the starting point. So I just wanted to point that out because it played such an important role in the championship hour. All right, so enough about the first hour. Let's go ahead and talk about the second hour, which is the championship race. And the first thing I want to talk about was the fact that the crowds were so into it and it was so large. It was great to see that DRL can make one of these races very entertaining, in which the crowds were there and they were enjoying themselves. At least that's what it looked like. It could not be true. You can always just edit the really good shots into a video, but it looked like they were having fun. And from what Jordan said, a lot of people were there and they paid to be there, and they looked like they were fans and enjoying themselves. So I definitely hope that is a forward trend and we will see more of that. It's definitely very encouraging to see. The second thing I want to talk about is I want to talk about perspective when it comes to watching these races. One of the things that I hear the most, and they are absolutely accurate, was that the racing was amazing. All the pilots were grouped together. They were so closely matched. It was amazing to watch this race, right? And the crowds, they oohed and awed and all that stuff. So from that point of view, I think it's absolutely correct. If you're watching this as a spectacle, it definitely delivered, and what I just said was completely true. But if you shift your perspective into thinking this on a points-based perspective, then the storyline's a little bit different, because what happened is two pilots basically dominated the rest. It was the Gab and Jet show, and then it was everybody else. From heats 1 through 5, they were the people that you talked about from a points perspective. 6 and 7, they were the only people that mattered. So from that perspective, it wasn't a close race. In fact, it was just two pilots that were competing for the championship spot. So what I'm trying to say is that, yes, the racing looked good, but if you're actually there to root for specific pilots, there were only two pilots that you could choose that you would be happy rooting for, because the rest of the pilots were eliminated so early on. So the racing can still be very close and it can still be very fun to watch from a spectacle point of view. But if you look at it from who's going to win the championships, there was only two pilots and the others weren't even close. So from that point of view, the racing was kind of lackluster if you want to think about it that way. I mean, at the end of the day, it was still good racing, and I think everybody would still enjoy it. I'm just kind of pointing out that things weren't as even as what a lot of people think if you just kind of shift your perspective and look at it from a points base. Other key things that I want to talk about was the fact that the pilots seem to be significantly more comfortable on the second day, and I think that attributed to less mid-air collisions, or at least a severe reduction in them, right? We saw a lot of times where 5 people were really close to each other going through a gate, and there were still not really that many mid-air collisions considering the proximity of them. So that was really interesting. It was one of those things where it's like I was expecting more mid-air crashes based off of the first hour, but it really didn't translate it when we saw it in the second hour. Another thing that could have contributed to that was that it seemed like the sun was lower or just completely gone. So maybe that, there wasn't that light, dark, high contrast, I'm blind type of thing that was going on the first hour or the first day of racing. So that might have contributed to that. I'm also surprised that some of the pilots that I was expecting to see do really well didn't, specifically Anub, right? Anub is a very talented pilot and he's always contending for pole position, the first spot. And it didn't feel like he was a part of the conversation on the second day. And it was very surprising that happened. It was the Jet and Gab show, but I expected, the other pilots, Anub, Wild Willie, to be a part of the conversation more. And it's so surprising that it just didn't roll out that way. Now, the competition between Gab and Jet was so good that it really didn't matter. It carried the show because they were just trading off so often, and it came down to the last heat. And it's also at this point where I didn't like how DRL portrayed how Jet won the last heat, to be able to win the championship. They focused in a lot on the power loop, in which that was the point when they exited the power loop that Jet passed Gab, and then he won that heat, thereby winning the championships. If you look at that heat, where Gab actually started falling off, or his critical mistake, it wasn't at the power loop, in which he exited poorly, allowing Jet to get ahead of himself. If you look at the race, where it started from was actually the inverted gravity gate. At that point, Gab took a longer line, and Wild Willie and Jet took the shorter line. And that's where he lost that half a second. That half a second was super crucial at the end, because if that half a second was there, if he had done a more aggressive line through that inverted dive gate, I think that it would have been a much closer race, if not Gab actually edging out Jet by just slightly. I think the storyline on how Jet beat Gab in the last heat could have been played out a lot better. There was really no need to focus in on just the power loop. Plus, at this point, this is the final race, and we know one of these two is going to win. All of the other racers don't matter, so they could have actually broken down Jet and Gab throughout the entire track and told the full story, which would have been much more impressive in my opinion. In one of the interviews with Gab was saying that Jet was on his A game. He was the one to beat today. And it's one of those storylines to where they should have done a better job explaining it, because when we saw Jet, he was like trying to get himself to breathe. He was shaking out the jitters. But at the same time, his face, his demeanor, it showed a lot of excitement, but it also exuded a lot of confidence. You know, if I were to relate this to like football, which is the only sport I really watch, he would be the big game quarterback. You know, he would show up in the big game and he would just lights out perform. And that's what we saw from Jet, was that from the moment the cameras turned on, he was excited and he was just on an A-plus game. Even Gab felt it and said it in the interviews. You know, he was waiting for the mistake and trying to capitalize on those mistakes in order to get his small window to be the champion. And it was just so surprising that they didn't really play that out as much as they should have. Again, if you watch the points, it was really the Gab and Jet show. So they should have just highlighted that more on the, you know, the B-roll stuff, the background stuff. That's my opinion on that. I can probably keep talking on and on about the championship race, but really, you should just go and watch it and enjoy it. I mean, there's a lot to take away from it. You know, it was one of those episodes to where, you know, it gives you hope that drone racing will make it. I don't know if it's going to be a major sport, but as one of the sports that people are willing to watch and also attend. So let's go ahead and start wrapping this up. There's a few items that I want to talk about. Number one is that the pilots that do really well in grassroots racing, it doesn't seem like that skill set translates directly over to DRL. There were a few pilots that definitely struggled throughout the DRL season, but I know for a fact that in grassroots racing, they are amazingly fast, almost unbeatable. So what we're seeing is that the difference between grassroots racing and DRL racing is so dramatically different that you don't really know if this pilot's going to do well until he actually is on the track and in front of the cameras. The tracks are so long, there's so much to memorize, plus there's the fact that the Racer 3 is a very unique drone racing machine, right? It weighs 1,000 grams, so it actually performs differently from the grassroots drone racing machines that we see, right? Those things are super light, super high torque, you know, they're just basically lightning in a bottle. I, for one, hope that the Racer 3 or the next derivation of the Racer 3, they keep that 1,000-gram limit, because I think that 1,000-gram limit is important, or it forces pilots to be more conscious of their racing lines, which is actually something that's very interesting, and it's something that's very fun to watch because you can translate racing lines over to other types of racing. Whereas with the grassroots racing drones, I mean, they're so torquey and they are so quick on acceleration that racing lines just don't mean or aren't as important to that type of racing as it does right now with DRL racing with the high mass Racer 3s. So I definitely hope that, you know, no matter what they change, they can make it more torquier, more powerful, smaller or bigger, as long as they keep that high mass, but also still make it very fast, very torquey. It just makes the racing look so much better on TV. Another point or another thing that I would like to see in the next season is telemetry data. I would actually like to see how well the actual quad is performing. It doesn't necessarily have to be all of the nerdy stuff, but during the FPV view, if we can actually show some part of the actual quad's performance, what it's actually doing, I think to some of the more nerdier audiences, which is basically the drone racing community, it's something that would be very interesting to them. So let's go ahead and switch gears and talk about the levels or the actual events. One of the issues that I have is that by the time we got to level 3, you either love the series or you're probably not going to watch, or you stopped watching. Either racing is important to you or it's not. And one of the reasons why I feel that way is that the levels don't build on top of each other. There's no continuity in between level 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on. I feel like they're all standalone. And one of the things that I think they should tackle is make it so that they build on top of each other, so that there's always something new and exciting that you won't see until the next level. And it's one of those things where I don't have an answer for you. It could be that, there's certain obstacles that you won't see until later levels. But I definitely feel like in other sports, they can get away with just moving in between stadiums because they have a place where they're always playing. There's heritage. There's a fan base that's already there. But because we're always moving these drone racing events to a new facility or a new venue, you don't really have that. So you have to replace it with something else. Obviously, we have Miami, in which there was already 2 races there. So there's actually some history, some heritage there. And I certainly hope they continue that because it could be something very cool. It can definitely be one of the places where they start actually inviting a live audience and start experimenting with that, because there's already 2 past events there. There's a lot of, knowledge that was already gained at that stadium, and they can definitely build on top of that to make it into a live event, a spectacle event of some sort, and then make it all the other events like that. Miami's a little bit unique in that point, but all the other events are one-off events. So it's going to be a challenge for their team to try to get those things to be strung together and make it flow and build on top of each other. Last thing I want to talk about, I have a bunch of other things, but I just don't want this episode to go that long. I would love to see a live stream of all the FPV views going on at the same time that this is broadcast on ESPN, so that if you wanted to watch an episode from your favorite pilot's point of view while having ESPN on so that you can hear the commentary, that you're allowed to do that. I think a lot of us who are really interested in this sport really want to watch almost the whole heat in FPV view. At least that's what I want to do. So if they could just live stream that, it doesn't even have to be super ultra quality. It could actually be the actual pilot's, CCD camera point of view, and I'd be perfectly happy with that. So long as it's in sync with the ESPN feed, I would really enjoy that. It's one of those things where I've been really looking forward to actually seeing this drone racing from the pilot's point of view, from the pilot that I want to choose. So if I wanted to, watch it from Nurk's point of view or Gab's point of view, I can actually watch the entire episode from their point of view. And it's also going to give you replayability, right? So that if you see that episode on again, you can jump on to the live stream and ride it out in another pilot's point of view and learn something, because every pilot's different. It's going to be fun. So there's, if 6 pilots are up and say they finish, that's a chance of having actually watched the episode from 6 new and unique perspectives. Okay, one last item, and I promise I'll end the episode. And this is one of those wild ideas that I would love to see, which is DRL coming out with their own goggles that are really cool looking on pilots. I'm talking like Iron Man close them up, glows the color that their drone's glowing. Because when their goggles go down and they are racing in a heat, it's kind of blah. There's really nothing going on there. If there's a way to be able to, take that, sync it up to what they're doing with the controller or what the drone's doing or how well they're doing in the heat, it would just make it look so much cooler to actually have the pilots in the view while the race is going on, or something to that degree. The goggles that we're used to seeing, I mean, they're great. They could internally be the same thing, but externally, I kind of wish that they were much cooler. All right, let's finally wrap this up. I had a great time doing these podcasts, Really appreciate everybody listening. Really enjoyed watching the DRL season. So let's hope for another successful 2018 season. Can't wait to see what pilots are going to be invited back, what new pilots are going to be coming, and what new changes they're going to have. Once again, thank you so much for listening to these short little podcasts, and I will catch you on the regular weekly FPV podcast.